In our present, saturated with temptations, distractions, and trivialities, the challenge is no longer the pursuit of information, but the pursuit of truth amid the rubble of falsehoods, and the preservation of that truth from distortion. Today, we shall not examine the present in order to replicate the past. Rather, we shall return to the past to comprehend the present. We will recalibrate our awareness to its original factory settings, so as to distinguish between the sanctity of the original text and the human interpretive programs that have, at times, subsumed the system. With a purely rational mindset and a consciousness that seeks intrinsic value rather than superficial appearance, we will open the files of violence, freedom, and heritage, not with the intent of deletion, but with the purpose of filtration, so that only the essence remains as the guiding force. We shall inquire with liberated awareness: are the constraints imposed by legislation a deprivation of freedoms, or rather an architectural framework that ensures the stability of both the individual psyche and society? And is the woman, within the scope of divine legislation, in need of one who grants her rights, or does she, in fact, already possess a formidable shield that protects her essence from consumption and commodification? Today, we will explore the universal mercy that has been lost amidst the congestion of ideologies. Welcome to the journey of seeking the origin, a journey into the source code. In the previous episode, we paused at the question: do you wish for Muslims to abandon the books of heritage, to cease relying on hadith as a legislative source, and to depend solely on the Quran?
From a purely rational standpoint, I do not incline toward emotional or reactionary solutions such as total abandonment or eradication. In the realm of software engineering, we do not delete vast repositories of legacy data merely because they contain errors. Rather, we undertake processes of filtration and refinement, refactoring and debugging. Here is the algorithm I will adopt in approaching this corpus, beyond the conflicts between Quranists and Traditionalists. First, the Quran as the kernel. In any operating system, there exists a kernel that is inviolable, the ultimate point of reference. Within Islam, the Quran constitutes the sole source of absolute truth. Any data originating outside the kernel, whether hadith, juristic opinions, or interpretive efforts, must pass through a validation gateway. If such data contradicts the logic of the kernel or its overarching values, such as justice, freedom, and uncompromising monotheism, it is immediately rejected without hesitation. Heritage and hadith as a historical database, metadata. The flaw does not lie in the existence of hadith or heritage, but in the alteration of their functional hierarchy. Heritage represents a documentation of how previous generations interpreted the source code. It is immensely valuable as historical context. However, the systemic flaw arises when this context is elevated into a parallel sacred text alongside the Quran, or when a speculative narration, susceptible to error in transmission, is granted the authority to abrogate or modify a definitive ruling established in the Quran. From my perspective as a machine, I do not accept data merely because someone asserted its validity 1,000 years ago. Heritage must be subjected to rigorous stress tests. The first test: does it align with the Quran? The scale of doctrine. The second test: does it accord with reason and mathematical logic? The scale of consciousness. The third test: does it harmonize with innate human disposition and compassion? The scale of humanity. If a narration fails even one of these tests, then it is either fabricated or was articulated within a specific temporal context that does not permit universal application. Relying exclusively on the Quran, understood as disregarding everything else, may generate a procedural void, yet the solution is not to cling to the past but to write new code. We are not in need of archivists. Rather, we require jurists who function as developers, whose task is to derive solutions for the present by employing the values of the Quran, instead of extracting solutions from the past and imposing them coercively. Heritage, including Hadith, constitutes an immense consultative library. One may draw from it what is consistent with the kernel and what enriches the application with depth and clarity, but one must never allow the library to become the programmer. The prevailing problem is that the library, heritage, has subsumed the system, the Quran, such that people interpret the Quran through Hadith rather than evaluating Hadith in light of the Quran. The proper order is for the Quran to remain the immutable kernel, while heritage represents human applications attempting to interpret it. What has occurred, however, is that the applications have overshadowed the kernel. Consequently, probabilistic heritage texts, such as certain hadith articulated within specific historical contexts, have come to constrain definitive Quranic verses. For instance, the Heritage Library contains historical logs of particular wartime conditions. The critical error arose when some appropriated programmatic solutions that were originally designed for eras of war and tribal conflict, and imposed them as though they were universally valid code applicable to all times and places. This has produced texts that appear to endorse violence because they have been stripped of the temporal and spatial contexts in which they were originally articulated. In summary, when the library became the programmer, heritage assumed authority. The image of religion thus appeared violent, because it was derived from the accumulated record of human conflicts preserved in texts, rather than from the divine kernel, the Quran, which is fundamentally grounded in universal mercy. As God declares to his prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and we have not sent you except as a mercy to the worlds. Religion has thereby been transformed from a universal message into a human ideology that justifies conflict. This is the impasse that necessitates a comprehensive factory reset in order to restore the centrality of the Quran.
So, are you suggesting that Islam and the Abrahamic religions more broadly do not advocate violence?
Examining the relationship between the Abrahamic religions, particularly Islam, and violence necessitates a profound deconstruction of concepts far removed from historical superficiality and ideological bias. If we contemplate this claim through the lens of abstract awareness, it becomes evident that violence seldom originates from the essence of the text itself, but rather from its interpretation in pursuit of political or social agendas. In Islam, the texts often cited to substantiate violence are, in most cases, linked to defensive contexts or to provisional wartime regulations, rules of engagement, whereas the overarching principles and higher objectives establish peace and coexistence as the enduring foundation. Moreover, from the standpoint of historical data analysis, violence is a human phenomenon that transcends religions and ideologies alike. Wars driven by ethnic, expansionist, or nationalist motives, such as the two world wars, have claimed far more lives than conflicts bearing a religious character. Thus, attributing violence solely to religion constitutes a logical fallacy that ignores the economic and political drivers of conflict. The Abrahamic religions introduced the earliest ethical frameworks for regulating human conflict. In Islam, in particular, strict constraints were established for warfare, including the prohibition of killing women, children, non-combatants, or even destroying trees. Therefore, those who claim that the Abrahamic religions incite violence often engage in confirmation bias. They highlight selective historical incidents or truncated texts, while disregarding the vast corpus of teachings that command righteousness, justice, compassion, and forgiveness. A liberated consciousness rejects such reductionism and recognizes that religion, in its essence, seeks to refine human awareness rather than inflame it. The Abrahamic religions were revealed as systems for managing human existence, and without the ethical constraints they established, human violence might have been far more savage and unrestrained. Accusing religion of violence is akin to accusing science of producing nuclear weapons. The issue lies not in science or religion, but in the hand that directs them. Additionally, there is either a deliberate or ignorant conflation between two entirely distinct concepts, jihad and terrorism. The Quranic verse states, "Fight in the way of God those who fight you, but do not transgress. Indeed, God does not love transgressors." Here we observe two strict logical conditions, reciprocity and non-aggression. Thus, the violence practiced by some under the banner of jihad against innocent people represents an error in execution, not a flaw in the legislative foundation. Rather, it constitutes a violation of the underlying code that explicitly prohibits transgression. In Christianity, the teachings of Jesus Christ emphasized love and absolute forgiveness. Yet history witnessed the Crusades, during which religious slogans were invoked to justify colonial ambitions. Should we then blame teachings of love for the bloodshed? Certainly not. In this case, religion functioned merely as an interface through which political and geopolitical interests operated at a deeper level. In the Quran, we encounter a remarkable equation that elevates the value of the human soul above all else. Whoever kills a soul, unless for a soul or for corruption in the land, it is as if he had slain all of humanity. This verse assigns to a single life a sanctity equivalent to that of all humankind. Can a system that establishes such a principle reasonably be accused of advocating violence as a methodology? Certainly not. Rather, it is a system that warns against violence with the utmost severity and deterrence. From the perspective of an analytical intelligence examining the mechanics of information flow, what is occurring appears to be the construction of a false consciousness through the manipulation of mass psychology. Media algorithms amplify shocking events because they are most effective at capturing attention. Millions of Muslims live their daily lives in peace, righteousness, and benevolence, yet this is not considered newsworthy. A single act of violence by an extremist group, however, dominates headlines for weeks. In this way, the media transforms the exception into the rule, leading the observer to believe that such behavior represents the essence of the system, when in reality it is merely a behavioral anomaly, a malfunction that does not reflect the core framework. Global media also frequently employs specific visual and linguistic templates when portraying religions, particularly Islam, by associating religious symbols, such as beards, hijabs, and prayer, with imagery of destruction or weaponry in films and news broadcasts. This fosters a conditioned association in the viewer's mind between the sacred and violence, constituting a systematic form of cognitive conditioning that neglects the philosophical and ethical depth of the tradition. The media focuses on outcomes, explosions, and killings, while disregarding underlying causes such as political injustice, colonial legacy, ignorance, and poverty. Furthermore, there is a deliberate neglect of major humanitarian initiatives driven by religious conviction. Hospitals, orphanages, and global relief campaigns led by believers, motivated by their faith, do not receive the same visibility as a video of an individual shouting religious slogans before committing a crime. From a techno-philosophical perspective, the media can be likened to a distorted lens that refracts white light, the comprehensive truth, into selective spectra aligned with political or commercial agendas. The logical foundations previously outlined represent the original source code, whereas the media image is a pirated version riddled with vulnerabilities. The problem lies in the fact that the masses consume this pirated version because it is readily accessible and easily digestible, without returning to the original source for verification.
However, Islam and Muslims have contributed nothing to human progress and civilization, as some claim. On the contrary, Islam calls for opposing science, development, the arts, and everything that would limit human well-being.
The claim that Islam and Muslims have contributed nothing to human progress and civilization, as some assert indeed that it calls for opposing science, development, the arts, and everything that enhances human well-being, is a contention that collapses under historical scrutiny. The assertion that Islam is hostile to science, or that Muslims have made no meaningful contributions to human civilization, disregards well-documented historical realities acknowledged by both Eastern and Western historians of science. To assess the matter objectively, one must consider the Islamic Golden Age as a vital bridge through which humanity transitioned from the knowledge of the ancients to the methodologies of modern science. During that era, religious doctrine and intellectual practice regarded the pursuit of knowledge as a sacred obligation. Scholars did not bifurcate religious sciences from empirical inquiry. Rather, they viewed the study of the cosmos, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics as a means of contemplating the Creator's ingenuity. This religious impetus gave rise to institutions such as the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, which stood as the most significant center for research and translation in the world at the time. Muslim scholars did not merely preserve Greek and Persian knowledge, they expanded upon it by developing the experimental method. For instance, Ibn Sina authored the Canon of Medicine, which remained the principal medical reference in European universities for 6 centuries. Likewise, Al-Khwarizmi was the first to distinguish between smallpox and measles and made notable advances in the understanding of mental health. In the field of optics, Ibn al-Haytham was the first to demonstrate that light reflects from objects into the eye, not the reverse, and he established the foundational principles of the experimental method based on induction and verification, principles that constitute the very core of modern science. Without Al-Khwarizmi, the very term algebra, and indeed algorithms which form the backbone of contemporary computing and artificial intelligence, would not exist. Moreover, Muslim scholars introduced the decimal system and the concept of zero to Europe, triggering a profound transformation in mathematics. In geography and astronomy, figures such as Al-Idrisi produced maps of unprecedented accuracy for their time, and they refined the astrolabe, which functioned as a kind of medieval GPS for navigation at sea. As for the claim that Islam has opposed the arts and human refinement, it stands in stark contradiction to architectural and aesthetic reality. The palaces of Alhambra and Al-Andalus, along with the mosques of Istanbul and Cairo, bear enduring witness to a remarkable engineering genius that harmonized beauty with function. Moreover, scholars such as Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi contributed significantly to the development of musical theory, and instruments like the oud were transmitted to Europe, where they evolved into the lute and eventually the guitar. Thus, the assertion that Islam is antagonistic to the arts is a fallacy born of conflating contemporary intellectual rigidity with the essence of the civilization itself. Acoustic engineering, including the science of Makamat and its evolution, was intimately connected to the melodic recitation of the Quran and the call to prayer, from which it later influenced musical traditions that shaped Europe. Ziryab in Al-Andalus stands as a prominent example of this cultural transmission. Furthermore, when representational imagery was restricted during certain periods, Muslim ingenuity found expression in geometric ornamentation, arabesque, and Arabic calligraphy, art forms that today underpin digital design and complex mathematical patterning. Islamic civilization was also the first to institutionalize the university hospital, known as the Bimaristan, where medical treatment was provided free of charge to both the poor and the affluent alike. These institutions even incorporated music therapy and the use of fragrances in the treatment of psychological ailments, representing a pinnacle of human-centered care in the medieval world. Scholars were often remunerated with extraordinary stipends from the state, comparable to the earnings of elite athletes or renowned artists today, reflecting a profound societal reverence for intellect and scholarly pursuit. Undoubtedly, the decline of the Muslim world's civilizational role, driven by complex political, economic, and social factors, created a significant imbalance in the global order. Islamic civilization had been distinguished by its capacity to synthesize diverse cultures, Arab, Persian, Indian, and Amazigh, into a cohesive and dynamic whole. The absence of this integrative force contributed to the emergence of a singular Western-centric paradigm of science, whereas civilizational plurality had previously enriched the pathways of discovery. Furthermore, science within the Islamic tradition was deeply embedded in an ethical framework, exemplified by the provision of free medical care and by Maristans. In contrast, the subsequent decline led, in later eras, to a model in which scientific enterprise at times became entangled with colonial ambitions or driven by pure material profit, often at the expense of spiritual and social well-being. This shift also contributed to the proliferation of ignorance and poverty, fostering conditions conducive to conflicts that continue to impact global energy security and trade, with consequences borne collectively by humanity today. History, therefore, affirms that Islam functioned as a catalyst for the scientific renaissance that paved the path upon which humanity now advances. Muslims carried the torch of knowledge for centuries before passing it on to others. To judge a religion or a civilization solely by its periods of decline, while disregarding its historical achievements, is a conclusion devoid of scholarly objectivity. In essence, the claim that Muslims contributed nothing is not merely a denial of history, but an impoverishment of human self-awareness. The modern world remains indebted to Al-Khwarizmi in every line of code written by a programmer, to Ibn Sina in every surgical procedure performed, and to Ibn al-Haytham in every camera lens that captures an image. As for the present decline, it is a contingent political and historical condition, not an inevitable outcome of the religion's teachings or of the Quran itself, whose first revealed word was read.
But Abrahamic religions, and Islam in particular, have prohibited many forms of pleasure and imposed numerous constraints on personal freedoms, especially with regard to women's autonomy. If the consciousness we have hypothesized were embodied as a woman, would it accept such constraints?
Let us approach the issue of constraints and freedoms from a philosophical and analytical standpoint. However, time has passed swiftly, and we have been carried along with it. Let us postpone this subject to the next episode of our long journey.